The Glass Blind Spot presents Milgram's most important message.
You can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man. You hear him hollering?
As I said before, the shocks may be painful, but they're not dangerous.
They're hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get that man sick in there. Look at he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word
I refuse to take the responsibility of getting hurt in there. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens. Continue, please.
2021 marked the 60th anniversary of psychologist Stanley Milgram's behavioural study of obedience. The first of Milgram's famous experiments, considering the conflict between obedience to authority and personal conscience. Participants were led to believe that they were assisting an unrelated experiment in which they had to administer electric shocks to a learner. These fake electric shocks gradually increased to levels that would have been fatal had they been real. Incredibly, 65%, 2/3 of participants, were prepared to deliver shocks to the highest level of votes.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, about 4 or 5 seconds, consider the answer wrong and follow the same procedures you have been doing for wrong answers. Say wrong, tell them the number of votes, give them the punishment, read them the correct answer.
Oh, man.
Continue, please.
Something's happening to the man. Nice one, gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
By the time I commenced my undergraduate studies some 30 years later, Milgram's shock experiment had become required reading. It remains one of the most widely known psychology experiments to this day. And indeed, it was an awareness of Milgram's research that first inspired me to sign up for a psychology degree. Today, as I reflect upon it with the perspective of some further 30 years of adult learning, it strikes me that one of his most significant revelations about the apparent ease at which adults will acquiesce to the commands of authority should have significant relevance to anyone seeking to promote an awareness and understanding of male psychology. This thought first occurred to me at the recent 2021 BPS Male Psychology Conference, while listening to clinical psychologist Martin Segar discuss the journey so far for male psychology in the UK. In particular, his frank account about the surprising opposition to the creation of a male psychology section from within the British Psychology Society's own membership. As a society, the BPS strive to embrace equity, diversity and inclusion in everything that they do. They've had a Psychology of Women section since 1988, and yet, for some reason, a full third of participating members voted against the proposal to launch a section promoting research, teaching and understanding of psychology applied to the well-being of boys and men. Such a revelation didn't remotely surprise me, and I believe can be considered as an example of the sort of everyday ignorance or gamma bias that one can all too frequently encounter when seeking to address structural and attitudinal barriers relevant to this area of psychological study. Since completing my postgraduate studies, I have progressed a career championing equality between the sexes and between people with other personal characteristics protected under equality law. For 2 decades, I've helped to guide businesses, charities, public policy makers and service providers through the sometimes daunting patchwork of statutory requirements, case law, best practice guidance and moral authority that instructs them on how to best do the right thing when it comes to the matter of promoting equality of opportunity for all. It's not always easy, but in truth, provided that they commit to some very basic principles, it's really not that hard at all. In recent years, it has been heartening to witness an emerging awareness and concern about areas of male inequality. And yet, 20 years of working within systems of support for equality has also taught me that talk of prejudice or disadvantage encountered by boys and men in this context can still all too often be seen as somehow taboo. Sadly, evidence of male inequalities can still sometimes be minimised or ignored. For example, when compared to conversations addressing the gender pay gap or underrepresentations in STEM, how often have you heard equality practitioners talk about inequalities of outcome in family courts, or the emerging trend that children in the Western world are more likely to live with a pet than their father? Meanwhile, men, especially straight, white, cisgendered, middle-aged men, are regularly presented as a group who can statistically be seen to benefit from inequality experienced by others, or, worse still, are somehow collectively regarded as responsible for the existence of such inequality. The richest of the rich and the world's most powerful are almost exclusively men. And yet, this lifestyle will not mirror the experience of the vast majority of the men that we know. It is also a reality that some of the most overt and obvious examples of structural discrimination in 21st century Britain can be evidenced by the support and status afforded to vulnerable victims of domestic and sexual violence, and even child abuse, based solely on grounds of their sex. By way of example, consider the fact that boys as young as 8 are still turned away from state-funded refuges solely on the protected characteristics of their sex. Or that the crimes of the most prolific rapist in British history, all committed against boys and men, are officially classed and recorded in government statistics as violence against women and girls.
We do what we're told. We do what we're told. We do what we're told. Told to do.
Such obvious examples of gendered gamma bias and direct sex discrimination were the catalyst for the creation of my multimedia research project, The Glass Blind Spot. Through this, I attempt to document and examine examples of the phenomenon where people consciously or unconsciously ignore information relevant to a conversation or debate about human rights, because it would detract or distract from their preferred political or personally motivated narrative. We all have our personal prejudices or blind spots, but a glass blind spot is so big that an otherwise obvious elephant in the room can comfortably hide there. It is my sincere belief that the most effective way to address the existence of such obvious elephants is, first and foremost, to point at them. My project started simply as a modest aspect of my own commitment to lifelong learning, based on a desire to understand more about the disadvantages and challenges experienced by what could be described as the Equality Act's least popular protected characteristic. As it has developed over time, and speaking from the perspective of an experienced equality practitioner, it increasingly strikes me that pointing at obvious elephants is very much the right thing to do, even if admittedly there can be potential detriments and dangers associated with such activity. As many of the men and women that I have met along my journey will contest to, the championing of male inequalities is rarely considered as an especially fashionable or cool thing to do. More so, such activities can also invoke quite dangerous and self-evidently baseless accusations from activists who would prefer that people like us desist from pointing at the sort of inequalities and issues that we do. And yet, despite such distractions, and at an instinctual level, pointing at elephants very much feels like entirely the right thing to do. All of which brings me back to Milgram and the most important message to come out of his experiments into the sometimes troublingly biddable nature of the human mind.
Hey, woman, soldier, dog, horse. Answer is woman, 450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on. Wrong answer. Continue.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is
You think you should look in on him, please?
not once we've started the
Well,
experiment.
what if something happens now?
The experiment requires that we continue. Go on, please.
Don't the man help me in any way?
Whether the learner likes it or not,
But he might be dead in there.
we must continue. Go on, please.
You're not even giving what, 450 volts every shot now?
That's correct. Continue.
White, 450 volts.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
Milgram's research was inspired by a desire to attempt to understand the actions taken by countless Germans that in some way ultimately contributed to the cold-blooded murder of millions of Jews by the Third Reich. Most particularly, his experiments were informed by the trial of the Nazi war criminal Otto Adolf Eichmann, who insisted that he was essentially a clerk, had no authority in the Nazi hierarchy, and was simply following orders. Eichmann has been described as a desk murderer and the embodiment of the banality of evil for his role in the facilitation and logistical management of the mass deportation of Jews into occupied Poland. For a time, the term Little Eichmanns even became a popular pejorative term for bureaucrats charged with indirectly or systematically harming others. It is, of course, something of a cliche to suggest that matters from another era have as much relevance in the today, and yet, as we embark upon a post-COVID lockdown era of advancing automation algorithms and great resets, presumably the possibility of little Eichmanns should very much remain a valid concern. Meanwhile, I've been surprised to learn that the authority underpinning many of the theories imparted to me by my respected teachers in the 1990s have in recent times been called into question by a crisis of replication impacting on many divisions of academia. In 2015, a study attempting to estimate the reproducibility of psychological science found that only 39% of the prestigious published experiments they considered could be successfully reproduced. Other studies have found similar problems with research findings across a range of disciplines, including physics, chemistry, medicine, and environmental science, such as a 2016 study that found fully 70% of the 1,500 scientists surveyed had tried and failed to reproduce published experimental results at some point. Incredibly, the fundamental credibility of findings from the famous Stanford prison experiment have also been significantly called into question. All of which caused me to wonder, how well has the Milgram shock experiment stood the test of time? Well, the short answer to that question is extremely well.
We do what we're told. We do what we're told. We do what we're told to do. Yes, we do what we're told. Yes, we do what we're told.
Numerous replications or slight variations on Milgram's basic experimental procedure have been performed since 1961, and a meta-analysis on the results of repeated performances of the experiment found that the average percentage of participants prepared to inflict fatal voltages matched his original finding of 65%. Some aspects of his methodology have aged poorly, and such an experiment would today breach BPS standards around subject duty of care. Also, only one variation of his experiment involved female participants. Perhaps the approximate 35% of BPS members who voted against the creation of a male psychology section may point to this as evidence that the now overwhelmingly female discipline of psychology is primarily the study of men in a man's world. As it happens, the all-female variation of his experiments produced similar results to most of the all-male versions. Two of Milgram's variations do stand out, however.
We do what we're told. We do what we're told. We do what we're told to do.
Peter Gabriel's song We Do What We're Told, Milgram's 37, points to the disturbing results of experiment 18, where when subjects could instruct an assistant to press the switches for them, an incredible 37 out of 40 subjects, 92.5%, shocked to the maximum 450 volts. In concert, Gabriel would ape the results of the experiment by commanding the audience to repeatedly chant, "We do what we're told," an instruction they always obediently followed.
Better. Louder. Good. You were louder than this before. better. Scream it like you mean it. We do what we're told. We do what we're told. We do what we're told. Told to do.
It was Gabriel's interpretation of this psychology experiment that first introduced me to Stanley Milgram's most famous finding. But after some 40 years of reflection on the power and influence of authority, I now believe that Milgram's most important lesson can be found in the results of experiment 17. In this variation, the subjects participated in the experiment in the presence of two other people, posing as participants who refused to fully obey. The first stopped at 150 volts, followed by the second at 210. And when witnessing these entirely ethical acts of disobedience, subject compliance dropped to 10%. Thus, whilst Milgram shows us that the majority of us may have a tendency to go along to get along, especially when coerced by authority, we are significantly less likely to do what we're told, to do things that, on an instinctual level, we know to be wrong. When we witness others questioning the legitimacy of the instructing authority and pointing at an otherwise self-evident truth. Happily, there are increasing examples of men and women persisting in such areas and overcoming ignorance and gendered gamma bias along the way, not least those involved in the establishment of the BPS male psychology section itself. In essence then, the most important lesson that we can derive from Milgram, and indeed many other studies concerning social pressure such as Solomon Asch's conformity experiment, is the fact that people are powerful social models for other people. This is the reason why I point at elephants, obscuring otherwise self-evident realities. My experience has been that such actions quickly lead to the discovery of many people around me who quietly share my perspective, or are already also pointing at things they instinctually feel to be wrong. It's a valuable lesson for any circumstance, and one I believe to be especially relevant to anyone seeking to promote an awareness and understanding of male psychology.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.